Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
He terrorized me to the point where I used to literally shake like that in his class, right? With complete and utter fear, because this guy would pick you up physically and punch you as hard as he could. I actually thought he had killed another kid. He picked him up and he punched him up under the solar plexus, and he collapsed on the ground and he lost his breath, and I said he's going to die. He was going to die.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month, and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here. In today's episode, I interview George McGrath, my very own father and creator of the incredibly successful YouTube channel Gundog and Fly, home to all things fishing, shooting, hunting and dog training. So if you fancy yourself a bit of an outdoorsman, make sure you check out the link for that channel in the description below. George, aka my dad, is a survivor of the Catholic Church, and in this interview he tells his story. So be warned, some viewers may find the content of this interview very upsetting, especially when you consider that it contains passing references to emotional and physical abuse directed towards children. Viewer discretion is very much advised. So without further ado, thank you very much for doing this interview, Dad. I sincerely appreciate it. Let's get into it. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and I'm incredibly honored here today to be joined by arguably an historic guest, and that is my very own father, George McGrath. Dad, you're very welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you. I know we've been organizing this for a long time, and absolutely thrilled to have you on the show today.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, and I have to really say, it's not just a mere pleasantry to say that I'm delighted to have you here, because like I said, we have been planning this for a very long time, but I do think that the topic we're going to be discussing today is of incredible importance, and it's just great to have you here to talk about it, really, to hear it from the horse's mouth, as the old saying goes. As you know, I do a lot of content on this channel where I critique the church, religion, and the Catholic Church more specifically. Mm-hmm. And, the critique obviously is the critique, and it may or may not sound compelling or persuasive coming from somebody who hasn't really lived it. I mean, anybody can read the books, but your flesh and bones, you've actually lived through the horrors of the Catholic Church in an Ireland of the not too distant past. And so to have you here sharing your story, it really is awesome. So I just have to say thanks again for joining me.
No bother.
Yeah, so folks, obviously, this is going to be a heavy conversation, and my dad here, George, is going to very much lead the conversation. So I wanted to start off, Dad, and just ask you, and for the benefit of the listeners, just to give us some brief biographical details, like what's your background, how big was religion in your family, what did your religious life look like as a young man or as a young boy? Was religion a big part of your life growing up, and was it emphasized in the home, and those kinds of details?
Well, for the benefit of anyone who's listening, I was born into what would be, I suppose, a small town in County Tipperary in Ireland, which would have been fairly typical of small towns in Ireland. I was born in 1961, and the town, like the difference between, we'd say, life now in this town and life back then is like chalk and cheese. It's like night and day. It was a different world entirely in every way. Where religion was concerned, I went to primary school, and that was under the auspices. They have basically the Catholic Church control the schools in Ireland. Well, the vast majority of them in any case, and they certainly had control of the school that I went to. Religion was taught as a subject, and basically all of the teachers themselves would have been religious people, although they weren't in the primary school. They weren't members of religious congregations, or should I say organizations, like they weren't priests, or they weren't Christian brothers or nuns or anything like that, but they were deeply religious themselves, and they made that they were involved in the church at all levels. Some of them worked with the priests and all that, so they were deeply embedded and involved in the church. So that was the environment into which children were brought, and religious teaching was a very serious subject, and it was taught every day. And along with that, you would be compelled by the teachers to attend various religious occasions that would be happening. There'd be, for instance, the May procession. Now, the May procession, it might seem mad and crazy in 2022, but virtually the whole town walked together in a circle. There was a circle, basically went from the church, went out of the church, up a road, and we did about a half a mile around a sort of a convent grounds, and then back to the church, and people were praying. They were very devout, and you can imagine this, all the houses along the streets we walked would have religious iconography out on the windowsills and candles lighting, and it was a very solemn thing, and you were compelled to attend these things. Now, we as kids would have gone to them anyway, because like it was something that was happening, because the town was small town, very quiet, not a lot happened. So if a lot of people gathered together we would have been there anyway. But you would be told that it was at school that you were required to attend. And there were other occasions. There used to be this period, I can't remember, I think it was around Easter time, when you'd have what they call devotions. And that would be outside of the masses that were held every Sunday, which were also compelled to attend. You had additional masses every evening during that period, and they was known as devotions. And I can remember you'd have to attend the devotions, and you'd have to be able to account for yourself the following day if you were questioned by the teacher, because they would inevitably question some of the pupils and say, well, what was the sermon about last night at devotions?
I see. And
if you didn't know, well, then there'd be further inquiries, and if they found out that you weren't there, well, then you'd be punished. Now, that punishment could range from, basically, if you missed devotions on one night, they'd give out to you fairly strongly, and they'd humiliate you in front of the rest of the kids, right? which wasn't nice for any child. But if you were a persistent offender like I was, because I had no interest in it at all, I was into my own things. I was a young kid, and I was into my own stuff, cowboys and Indians, for instance, playing war games and all that. That was what I wanted to do, and I just found all this
because you were a child.
Exactly.
Because you were, shockingly enough, because you were
exactly.
a child. You just
and
wanted to play cowboys and Indians.
I found all this church stuff just completely boring, and I was bewildered by it all. I didn't understand any of it. Like, what they taught us in school was that there was a heaven and a hell, and if you didn't behave, and if you didn't go to devotions and go to church and all that stuff, well, then you were going to suffer for eternity in flames. And if you did what they wanted you to do, well, then you were going to ascend to heaven, and you were going to be on the right hand of Christ and all this. And it was all kind of mesmerizing, really. But it was scary stuff at the same time, because these people were adults, and they had authority, and obviously they must have known what they were talking about. So when they were telling us all this stuff, you took it seriously, but at the same time, I could see no sense in any of it. It didn't compute in my head. I just wanted to do my own thing. So being compelled to attend these events was, you went because you had to. So I was a persistent offender. I didn't attend as often, and I'd be sometimes physically punished. Now, they'd beat that shit out of you in front of your classmates to set an example, And usually it wouldn't just be me, because the other guys who were into the Cowboys and Indians would be with me, and we would be then. We were kind of identified as persistent offenders, if you like, against the system. You know what I mean? We were always not just in terms of the religious stuff, but we were kind of rebellious anyway. The side of the town that I came from would have been the poorer end of the town, and we would have been rebellious anyway. We were kind of, what do I call it? Most of us, the majority of us, came from homes that weren't all that steady in the first place. You know what I mean? Talking about the homes and how religion was in the homes, like my mother or father didn't attend mass only on occasions, like if there was some christening or wedding or something like that. So they weren't religious in the sense of being attending events and all the rest of it. But at the same time, they identified themselves as Catholics, and they believed in all the stuff that goes with it, you know, about virgin births, and they believed in all kinds of what I now understand to be superstitions. Like I remember one time because I was into Cowboys and Indians, I always wanted to be an Indian. So I used to be constantly making bows and arrows and stuff like that. And we lived in a small town, as I said, and we lived right on the edge of it. So therefore the countryside was all around. And I would be out cutting sticks off the ditches and hedges, and I'd be making bows and arrows, you know. And I one time brought in an elder stick. I'd made a bow with it, and I brought it into the house. Oh, my father lost the plot. That was the stick that was used to beat Jesus that was the kind of a stick that they used to beat Jesus when he was carrying the cross down the road or whatever he was doing. And elders, now I don't even know whether they grow in the Middle East. But
he believed it.
He believed it, and like I was forced to take it out of the house, and I was told in no uncertain terms that they'd possibly have to get a mass said in the house and all the rest of it. Like this was a serious offence. I was bewildered again by all that. So that just gives you an idea. Even though my parents weren't religious as such, they were affected by it all. They were part of it in the sense that they perpetuated all the sort of nonsense ideas. You know what I mean? They would use, how do I put it, like, and it's common in Ireland even up to the present day. You know, people will say, well, in the name of Mary and Jesus, it's sort of to make something emphatic, to make an emphatic statement about anything. You'd preface it with some religious, like, I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. That God may take away one of me children in the morning. This is the truth. Or, you know, religion is intertwined in everything, even up to the present day. But back then, it was every place.
Yeah,
it was everywhere. It was involved it was involved in everything and every aspect of life. Yeah, and
down to the phraseology that people used.
Yes,
down to every breathing sentence, essentially.
Yeah, I can remember one time, myself and another fellow who I used to hang around with. Now, we were very rebellious, I have to say, but we were only children. I think we were around maybe 11 or 12 years of age. That would have been maybe 10, 11, 12, round about that. And I can remember the two was, I can't remember what class we were in. Basically, the classrooms you had a babies class, then you had what was known as high infants, and then you had 3 or 4 more classes up along. We were, I think, maybe in 3rd class or something like that. I can't remember exactly. But if you committed some offence, you could be punished by the teacher in that particular class. But if the offence was egregious enough, then you'd be brought up to the head, the principal, which was 2 classes. They were divided by basically sliding walls, if you like, and you'd be brought up to him to account for whatever you had done. And I can remember we had done something out of the way, as in terms of we hadn't attended some religious event or whatever, and both of us were brought up to the principal. And for that alone, to be brought up there, and I remember pissing me pants in fear of what was going to happen. And the pool of piss, I can remember it as clear, and that's 50 years ago. I can remember the pool of piss on the floor and it running down my leg with just pure fear of the fact that I'd been brought to the principal, because I was in awe of him. You know what I mean? Because he was ultimately powerful. And I can't remember what punishment we got. They used to beat us on the hands with leather straps and stuff like that.
Fuck.
And hold out your hands and take. And apparently, my understanding was the leather straps were actually supplied by the Department of Education. Can you believe it?
Of course they were. Of course they were. That is absolutely, like, I mean, you obviously know that I'm a teacher, and when I just think about the classroom now, and I think about, you know, the punishments that we adjudicate over and so on, you know, students get a timeout and they miss their break time and they feel very hard done by. And at no point am I suggesting, by the way, that kids today should be grateful for not being abused, because clearly the obvious fact that's the elephant in the room here is that what these people were doing to you and to the rest of Ireland and in countries all around the world, wherever the Catholic Church has been, what they were doing was absolutely abhorrent, atrocious.
What they did as well, and it just, I need to talk about these things as they occur to me, because I might forget them as we go along.
Please do.
From time to time, and I can't remember, it was they used to bring in people into the school, right, for when we'd be getting these different sacraments, like Holy Communion, right? We'd all have to learn all this stuff, all this catechism and all these different religious stuff. And then a bishop or someone fairly high up in the hierarchy, when he'd be visiting on the day, all the stops would be pulled out for him. Like, I mean, he was next nearest thing to God, if you know what I mean. And like, we'd be it was like a military organization, the way it would be run to suit the bishop. We'd all have to be in our best clothing, and we'd have to be brushed up on all the religious stuff, all the catechism and all that, in case he asked us any questions and all that kind of thing. And then you'd have, from time to time, you'd have the career, what would I suppose would be the equivalent now of career guidance people. They'd come in, and I can remember they had leaflets, and they'd hand them out, and they'd be different. Would you like to be a carpenter? Would you like to be, say, for instance, an electrician, plumber, blah, 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 blah. And then there was the priest one. And any of the boys, and I remember it, and some of them were clever enough to do it, any of the boys that would say, yeah, I'd really like to be a priest, they were particularly favoured by the hierarchy in the school, because they aspired to being a priest, which was like, this was the ultimate, what I call it, the ultimate job, if you like. You know what I mean? To be a priest. And in 1960s and 1970s Ireland, and up into and including the 1980s, if a family had a son or a daughter that was either a priest or none, that was a feather in your cap. Like that gave you status in the community. My son is a priest, and he's working in such whatever the place. You know, the fact that you had a priest or a nun in the family was very, very
social capital.
Yeah, it gave you a lot of status, you know, and people would oh, my son is a priest, you know, and or my daughter is a nun. I don't think it would be the same now. I don't think they can get any recruits now. They're struggling to get priests and nuns. I think they're having to go to Africa and places like that to get them now. But in Ireland, I think they've crashed. They can't get them anymore, or very, very few in any case. But
turns out that abusing the nation's children is not a great recruitment tactic.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So, but it's what I'm trying to emphasize, I suppose, is the importance of being seen to be connected to the church in any way at all. But ultimately, the natter of the whole thing was, if you could get to be a priest or a nun, or if you had a relative who was a priest or a nun, well, then that gave you it gave you not only status, but it gave you leverage in the community, if you know
power.
What I mean. Yeah, it gave you leverage in the community. It's frightening when you think about it, the power that they had. Like, priests would walk into people's private houses on the basis of rumors that they'd heard that people weren't living a proper Catholic life, and they'd come in, fists on the table, and start dictating and telling people, you want to be getting your act together, and when was the last time you were at mass, and all this kind of stuff. And really, like, they had that power.
Yeah.
To just, and people were terrified of priests and anyone who was connected. That my grandmother, my great grandmother would almost have a heart attack if they thought that a priest might call to the house for any reason. But if it was for the reasons I just outlined, if they had in some way transgressed, which wouldn't have happened, but like the mere thought of that would have been terrifying.
It reminds me of one of the stories a brother of yours told me, who shall remain nameless. But he said that he was sitting on a bench one day with a girl. He was only like 17 or 18, and a priest from the town, who also shall remain nameless because we don't want to be done here for besmirching somebody's name. But this priest, while your brother was sat on the bench with this girl that he was seeing, saw fit to cross the road and interrupt them. And he looked at the girl. He didn't look at your brother. And he said, you could do better than to be with him.
Yeah.
And then just walked on. Like, that was the kind of social authority. That was the kind of, like, the boldness of that. Like, when I think of Becky and I, my fiance, any long-term listener will know of Becky because I never shut up talking about her. But when I think about that, if I was sat on a bench with Becky and a priest came across the road and saw fit to interrupt us, I mean, I'm not a violent man, but I would find it difficult not to assault someone if they behaved that way. So anyway, look, sorry to interject. It's just it just occurred to me.
Yeah, but
it's just another story that demonstrates the authority and the righteousness that they had.
Yeah, but that rapidly faded though in the 1980s. From the 1980s onward, they had that sort of power for generations up till sort of, I think, the mid-1970s onward, it started to wane. That power wasn't going to be tolerated to the same degree because people started to, like a lot of the movements will say that were happening around the world, such as the hippie movement, for instance, and the civil rights movements and that sort of thing. It gave people more power. And people their minds were opened up to new things. See, Ireland was very, very insular and very closed off. Hugely up until the 1970s. It was like when I was brought up in the 1960s in Ireland, it would have been the equivalent of the 1920s in Britain, say.
Yeah.
Like speaking about society in general, you know, like it was very, very, very backward and very poor and priest-ridden society. It was the priests were running around, they were running everything, they were involved in everything. They ran people's lives effectively.
Yeah.
But like from the 1970s onwards, and they went into a rapid decline after the 1980s. Their power waned big time. Of course, all the scandals and all the stuff that went on, like there was one thing I remember now, this was during the 1990s when there was a particular Bishop Casey.
Casey, I knew you were about to mention Casey.
It was a famous case here in Ireland.
Yeah.
He did what came naturally. He had sex with a woman and she had a child, right? The child was hidden away, but this woman came out and broadcast the fact that she had had sexual relations with him while he was a bishop.
Which is a big no-no, just for our international listeners, because not every form of Christianity forbids this, but in the Catholic Church, those who take up holy orders are supposed to remain celibate, just to be clear.
For a bishop to actually cross that line, the whole country was in absolute shock. It was the talk of the nation. Every single you would meet would be talking about it. It was all over the TV, the news, and of course the Catholic hierarchy went into meltdown over but the religious people, they refused point blank to believe that such a thing was possible.
Yeah.
But like the evidence was there finally, that like it was patently obvious, it was clear as the nose on their faces that
two things on that which are very funny. One is Billy Connolly. He said that he said this live on stage once. He said the Irish are a great laugh, and the kind of self-deprecating humor they have about their culture and their religion. He said he was in Ireland one time and he saw somebody wearing a t-shirt with a picture of a condom on it, and the condom was wearing a bishop's hat, and underneath it said "just in casey." Like you need a condom just in case, but they turned case into Casey, which was hilarious. And the second thing is Father Ted which is a hugely popular, it was like a social phenomenon in Ireland, precisely because it was challenging this status quo. Father Ted, for our international listeners, if you're not familiar, is a BBC-produced, serialized comedy centered around 3 priests, and all this show did was take the piss out of the Catholic Church. But one of the characters in it, Bishop Brennan, it's revealed in an episode that he has a family in America and a son and the whole shebang, and like they were poking fun at this Justin Casey thing as well as the church more broadly. So yeah, it's fascinating to think about how shocked people were. Whereas now in 2022, if there was a story of a bishop that had an affair, people wouldn't even change the television channel to watch the news broadcast about it.
That's at all.
You know, it would just be, oh, so they're at it again, are they?
there was another priest then as well, and he was a very famous priest because he used to be on the TV all the time. They called him the singing priest, and he used to sing sort of folk songs and stuff, and he'd be all the time on the TV. He'd be on the Late Late Show, which is the biggest show on Irish TV, and he'd be on various different programs singing songs, and he was kind of the happy face of the Catholic Church, if you like. But it was found out subsequently that he had children all over the place.
Of course he did.
And like they took him immediately off the TV, you know.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. So he had quite a few children apparently with various different women, and but like, there was always people, all the priests, you see, they lived on their own in houses on their own, but they all had housekeepers, which were inevitably female, you know?
Yeah, especially at that time. When
people became more irreverent and felt freer to say things, they'd say, I bet you he's knocking off the what do you call it, the maid or the housekeeper, you know, and people would begin to say things like that, you know, without fear of great retribution. You know, some people say, hey, don't be talking about the priest like that, or, you know what I mean? But people from the 1970s on, people just gained freer expression, if you know. And it was like it happened very suddenly.
Isn't that a beautiful thing, though?
Yeah, but once it started to roll at all, then it gained momentum very quickly to the point now where, like, a priest, for me, like, is, as far as I'm concerned, is just a deluded person.
Yeah. If somebody's family in Ireland announced that their son was entering the priesthood in 2022, people would probably respond to that with rather ill-concealed laughter.
They would.
Like, it would be an embarrassment now. In fact, I suspect that somebody wouldn't even make it news. Like, you know, if their son was going into the priesthood, they might actually try to keep that quiet in 2022. And again, I can't help but feel that that's a positive change.
Yeah.
You know,
see, most people's view of the church. Now, bear in mind, we're still deemed to be a Catholic country and with a Catholic ethos and this, that, and the other. And the Catholic Church still has a lot of power here in this country. Make no mistake about it. They have a lot of power here. And they are...
Well, there's a reason I can't get a teaching job there. We'll just put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. But they have a lot of power, and there's still a sizable part of the population that are deeply religious, and they also have a lot of power, and they bring a lot of pressure to bear where, we'll say, what I would deem social advancement is concerned, where they would resist they'll resist everything. They've resisted every positive sociological change we've had here in this country. Yeah. They resisted contraception. At one point, they even resisted tampons for women. Can you believe that? Yeah. And they resisted divorce. They needless to say, they resist any change in legislation regarding the status of homosexuality.
Well, I was just going to say, the most recent 3, so they resisted the gay marriage referendum, which they lost in triumphant fashion, I would argue. Yeah. They resisted the abortion rights referendum, which again, they lost spectacularly. And they also resisted the change in the blasphemy laws, which they lost spectacularly. The people of Ireland, I'm very proud to say, and I'm not generally patriotic, but on the result of those 3 referendums, the people of Ireland made me very, very proud, because in those 3 referendums, the people of Ireland voted by a significant majority in each one of those referendums. I think it was like 70-30 on average.
That's right.
People voted to abolish blasphemy law, they voted to legalize gay marriage, and they voted to legalize abortion. The 3 biggest middle fingers to the Catholic Church that could ever have occurred. And when you think back to when you were a boy and when you were going through school in the 60s, to think that you know, a mayor 50, 60 years later, the Irish people would be voting by a landslide victory on those three topics. I mean, it's just unthinkable. It just shows...
It's a huge change in a very short period of time relative to the hundreds of years previous where they had massive power. So I'm very proud, of course, that has happened also. And the vast majority of Irish people now are very open-minded and broad-minded about virtually... We're very socially advanced, if you like, here in Ireland. Much more
progressive.
So than... we're very progressive, much more so than some other countries, I go so far as to say. And if you were to walk out on the street here now and would just choose, for instance, a teenager and ask them, do they believe in what the Catholic Church, they'd laugh at you.
Probably.
They don't, it doesn't have anything like the same resonance to people anymore. It certainly doesn't have the same respect. But there is a hardcore.
Yeah.
No mistake about it. There is a hardcore, and they are very, very right-wing. Yeah. They are extremists in the extreme. There's one guy in jail at the moment here in Ireland. It's an ongoing case, so I suppose it's sub judice. He's in prison because, now, it's something I'm not very well versed on, but he refuses to use certain pronouns in the school for some kids that identify as LGBT or whatever the case may be. But he is actually in prison. Now, he's not in prison for that. He's in prison for contempt of court because the school authorities apparently said to him, listen, you've got to use these pronouns because that's the way it ought to be. Yeah. And he said, no, my religious convictions tell me no. And he was told to stay away from the school, and there was a court order against him. Yeah, and he insisted then on coming into the school, so he's actually in prison for contempt of court as opposed
for going to the school despite being asked not to. Yeah, basically.
So, but that's like there is him, and there are many like him who are hardcore and they dig in the heels and they're prepared to even go to prison. Their convictions are very important to them, obviously, but the vast majority of people in Ireland now are not like that, and I think we're secularizing faster than any other European country.
Yeah, and that's certainly been my experience. I mean, it would be insulting to you if I were to, relay my negative experiences with the Catholic Church growing up as a schoolboy, because they don't even hold a candle to the, I hope you don't mind me using this word, but they don't hold a candle to the torture that you experienced. But just by way of reference, I will say that growing up in the 90s, the Catholic Church still had an immense amount of influence. I remember friends of mine being sent outside the class for daring to bring up evolution as an alternative to the creation narrative, for example. And I remember my mates being punished for bringing that up. But again, when I say punish in that context, what I mean is they were sent outside of the classroom. That's still very wrong, by the way. But the only reason I bring it up is because between the 90s and, say, even the early noughties, most of that had basically dissipated. Certainly by the time we got to 2011, 2012, that had basically vanished. And again, I think this is all a positive change. But going back to your childhood being raised in the church, you told us about your primary school experiences, Dad. Could you take us on the next leg of the journey when you entered secondary school? If I remember correctly, your secondary school was it a Christian Brothers school?
That's right, yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, that was a big occasion. Like the two schools concerned, the primary school was at one end of the town, and the Christian Brothers school, which needless to say was run by the Christian Brothers, was at the other end of the town. I can remember it as if it was only yesterday, on the day we were effectively moved from the primary down, and we were walked down and we were introduced into the school and all the rest of it. Now, there were some changes taking place even back then. And that would have been, I would have been, 11 or 12, I'm not sure, when I was brought down. I'm not sure of the age, but I would have been pre-teenage. 11, 12 or 13, I'm not sure. We were brought down and we were brought into the brother school, right? And that was going to be... we're going to be there until such time as you did a leaving cert and you moved on to go into the workforce or whatever the case may be. Now, there were changes taking place there. Now, I wasn't aware of any of this at the time, but what I did know was, and I think it was the very first time, that school had been run exclusively, every single class was run exclusively by, you see, I use class. I think you use year in England, don't you? Like you have year 1, 2, 3, whatever.
Yeah.
In Ireland here, you had 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th class, and then this is in the post-primary now. Okay.
Yeah.
Then you had first,
secondary school, what they might call high school in America. Yeah.
I'm trying to get so that people can understand, but basically what it was. So the teachers were, I'm fairly sure, up till the year I started, were exclusively Christian brothers. So you would have been taught exclusively. But in the year I started, they brought in 2 lay teachers. And I mean,
and by lay teachers, you mean non-religious, secular types?
Correct. Yeah. Yes. They may have been religious in their own lives, but they weren't Christian brothers, or they weren't priests. They weren't involved.
They weren't in holy orders.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
So one of them, in fact, and I know him. I meet him regularly, even now. A gentleman he is. He is religious in his own right, and he's perfectly entitled to be. But he didn't impress that upon us in the school, right? He taught various different subjects, but religion was taught by the Christian brothers. Now, there were certain Christian brothers in that school who were, in my view, dangerous psychopaths. They were dangerous people. They had an effect on me which has lasted to the present day, and I'm 61 years of age. They terrified me. I mean, literally terrified me. There was 2 in particular. Now, I have to say that not all of them were violent, but there were 2 of them that were violent in the extreme. One of them would beat you on the back of the hands with a drumstick. He used to play the drums.
Jesus.
He played the drums, believe it or not. And he liked to, and when I think back on it, I didn't understand any of this at the time, but when I think back on it, I can remember it. And it actually, there's a video of school kids and a crazy teacher in a Pink Floyd video, The Wall, where he's marching up and down between the desks in a military fashion. And that was what he was like. He marched up and down between the desks, and you were assigned to do particular things. And if you didn't do it meticulously according to his instructions, he would beat the shit out of you.
He was a drummer, and his favourite drum kit was The Hands of Children, the evil bastard.
But not only that, what he used to do was he used to set us tasks that he knew we couldn't attain, to deliberately give himself the opportunity. He was so frustrated in himself. What he would do was he would say to us, "You're to sit directly upright like this. You're to put your 2 hands on the desk, and you're to look straight ahead." Now, you try doing that as an adult for any period of time, right? Try it for 10 minutes. See how long you can maintain it. But for a child of 12 or 13, it's an impossibility. Yeah. So you would inevitably redirect your eyes or move your hands or something, and he would be watching like a praying mantis for this to happen. Have you now? And he would grab whoever, and he would literally punch him around the road, punch him around the classroom.
And when this was happening, I'm assuming the other kids in the room were expected to remain obedient, silent, and unmoving.
They were stunned by fear into silence.
Jesus Christ.
Okay? You would literally be shivering inside, right, and hoping that he wouldn't zone in on you, you know? So he was the first one, right? He was an absolute nutcase, and he terrified us, right? But there was worse to come. Now, between him and the guy I'm going to talk about now, there was a lay teacher, right? And then there was another Christian brother who wasn't too bad. They were all very, very strict and rigid. But then I got to the class, right, first year. It's impossible to forget. I ran into Brother Vaughan, right? This man was 6'2" or 3. He was definitely 18 stone weight. He was a big man, and he exuded power. He was huge. He was a huge man physically and in every other way, if you can imagine. He was a very imposing figure. And again, he was a violent psychopath. He taught, believe it or not, physics and religion. They were his two subjects.
It's not like those two things are in conflict.
And I can remember we had physics on Wednesday just after lunch, and we had religion on Friday evening, a last class before finishing up. I can remember that, and that's 46 or 7, maybe 48 years ago. And he terrorized me to the point where I used to literally shake like that in his class, right? With complete and utter fear, because this guy would pick you up physically and punch you as hard as he could. Right? I actually thought he had killed another kid. He picked him up and he punched him up under the solar plexus, and he collapsed on the ground and he lost his breath. And I said he's going to die. He was going to die. Right? This was the sort of psychopaths we were dealing with. But I know in retrospect why they were like that. Now, maybe they were innately like that to a degree, but the lives they were living were so unnatural. Like, they were living celibate lives. The likelihood is they didn't choose of their own volition to join these organizations. It was their parents sort of coerced them into it to give them status in the community. Oh, my son is a Christian brother and he teaches in the CBS in Cashel, the Christian Brothers School, CBS we call it. So like, these guys were in there, and like, because of the social pressure of the times, very, very few people ever left any of these organizations. So they were in a trap and they were caught in there, and they were there with all these kids, and that's where they vented their frustrations.
I don't want to put you in a difficult position here, but I have to ask this question because it's burning in my brain here. In some sense, the way you've described the Christian Brothers, I know that they are the ones who are responsible for hurting you and many others. But the way you've described them there, I must admit, is quite profound, because you seem to have described them, even though they were brutal and unpleasant and despicable in their own way, but you seem to describe them in a kind of victim-like manner as well. Is that what I'm detecting? Would you be prepared to say that they were, despite how evil they were, that they were, in a sense, victims of the system as well?
They were, but at the same time, they were victims of the system. There's no question about that. But at the same time, every man knows wrong from right.
Yeah.
Everyone has personal responsibility. They knew at some level that what they were doing wasn't right. Beating up kids and doing what they did, terrorizing children. I remember when I was so in fear of Vaughan that I used to get other kids in the higher classes to write out a little note. George can't attend school this afternoon because he has to go to the dentist. But you can only write so many notes and get away with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I remember giving in those notes, and the relief to be like, it was the tension and the fear of this guy was so profound that it caused such huge anxiety that if you could get out of it, the relief, even to just get away from him for one afternoon or to get out of one of his classes, was massive. It was having a huge psychological effect, not only on me, but I have some of my former classmates went on to develop serious issues and problems as a result of their experiences in school. Now, they had other issues going on in their lives as well. Some of their families were dysfunctional and all the rest of it. But I have no doubt, none whatsoever, that the treatment they received under the Christian Brothers and the Catholic Church had a profound effect on them and what they went on to experience in their lives. A lot of it negative.
And just for anybody who's watching, because I can, my channel is the Magic Skeptic at the end of the day, and there's going to be skeptics watching this who are going to say it, but George, maybe your experience was atypical. Maybe the Christian Brothers in other parts of Ireland weren't like the psychopaths that you dealt with. But let me be the first to say, and I know you're well read in this, Dad, as well, but no, this experience is actually rather ubiquitous. It's up and down the country, and it's not only just national, it's international. Wherever the Catholic Church has been, wherever it has had ultimate control over children, there have been abuses the likes of which I won't even begin to describe because it would just make everyone feel ill. This is, an international pattern of toxic, brutal, abhorrent behavior. And it absolutely breaks my heart that I'm sitting here having this conversation with my very own dad and that you went through this. It just absolutely breaks my heart.
And like, I talk very frankly. I mean, it like, besides, like, there are a lot of influences in everybody's lives, right? But the influence of those Christian brothers in particular had a very profound effect on me personally. Now, there were other kids in the same class who may not have been affected to the same degree by virtue of maybe their personality, or they had a good stable background, or whatever the case may be. Unfortunately, I was just one of the people who it really had impacted on. And I've had to deal with a lot of issues in my own personal life over many years. And I've had the negative impact that those people had on me went on to affect me negatively in a lot of areas of my life. And I'm now, if you like, out the other side, if you know what I mean. I've had to come to terms with it, and I can, in some sense, I have reconciled myself with it, right? But it took a long time. It took a long time. I still dream about it. I still have negative effects from it to a degree, but nothing like it used to, because I've done a lot of work on myself in order to overcome it. But like, not everybody gets that opportunity. Not everybody is like, I'm not claiming any great credit, but not everybody has done the same level of work that I have on myself to, if you like, come out the other side and have a perspective on it that I can live with. I know people who died as a result of what they experienced. They went on to kill themselves with addictions and suicides and all the rest of it.
Because they couldn't live with the reality of what had happened.
Yeah, well, people will say, well, listen, he committed suicide because of A, B, C, D, whatever the case may be. But I am in no doubt that the treatment they received under the tutelage of the Catholic Church and in the schools were, without any question, a contributing factor in their problems or their in some cases, their deaths. You know what I mean? Now, loads of people will probably maybe take issue with that and say, well, listen, he committed suicide for completely different reasons altogether. And that may well be true. But I'm convinced that everyone's an individual and everyone's different and everybody experiences things in their own way. And I experienced it my way, and I have come to terms with it in my own way. Some people don't ever come to terms with it. Some people come to terms with it in other ways, and they get on to live their lives and maybe not have them the same level of negative effect for as long as I had it. Because it's only in relatively recent times, I would say in the last maybe 10 years, that I have moved beyond it, if you know what I mean. I still remember it all. It can still negatively affect me, but I'm able to cope with it now, whereas before I would have suffered a lot mentally as a result of it.
Well, now, sorry, go ahead.
Bear in mind, there are other factors besides. I have to qualify it in a sense. I don't blame that alone for the issues that I've had in my life, but they were, without question, a large contributing factor.
Well, and I swear I don't mean this patronizingly, but I just think it's very brave of you to come on here. You said you're 61 years of age, to come on this podcast and to speak so openly and honestly and frankly about it. I personally think is very brave. You mentioned other survivors of the church and how they've just essentially, what you were inferring, I'm guessing, is they've either killed themselves or they're metaphorically dead because they're living in a bottle. They're living at the end of a whiskey bottle, or they've smothered their feelings with drugs or whatever. And by the way, the people who would push back and say, oh, well, I know he was, abused by members of the Catholic Church, but I don't think that had anything to do with his suicide. That to me is an alarmingly stupid statement.
Yeah.
You're telling me this child, when they were 5, or a little older perhaps, they were mercilessly beaten by a 6'2" psychopath with a white collar. I wonder, did that have some kind of an impact or an influence on the fact that they offed themselves? I think that's the most stupid question in the history of questions.
You see, the physical abuse itself, right, was, if you like, short-lived, right? A couple of minutes of beating. But the thing that was worse than that was the fear of it happening. Like, when you'd be in the classroom, or even the anticipation of going to the classroom for hours beforehand, or even when you wake up that morning, let's say the class was going to be at 4 in the evening. When you got up in the morning, and even the day before, you'd be in fear of anticipating, and then it was like a build-up, and that you entered the classroom in such a state of fear and anxiety that the beating, in a sense, was to some degree inconsequential. It was the whole thing together. It had such an effect, and I think when you're dealing with children in particular, and you know this, Dara, from working with children, you have to be very careful. If you do this sort of stuff that I've just described to a child, you injure them in a place that can't be fixed.
An indelible mark.
It cannot be fixed. Like, I've would say lived with it all my life, right? And it's never been fixed per se. You can't eliminate it and just get rid of it like you would a head cold or the flu. You take tablets and it's gone. This thing is with you forever. And basically what you can do is you can try, if you have the capacity, and bear in mind, I'm not claiming any great credit for having more capacity than anybody else. If you have the capacity to learn how to cope with it all, and learn to find some way of coming to terms with it and finding a perspective on it that you can live with. But not everybody has that capacity. That's the thing. Not everybody has the capacity, and people, like I said, and maybe I'm repeating myself, but there were people who didn't have, for whatever reason, they never got the opportunity, or whatever the case may be, or they just didn't innately have the fighting ability or whatever.
And they can't be blamed for that.
They can't be blamed for that, no.
One has to be forgiven for failing to get over torture that happened on a consistent and grand scale. I mean, goodness gracious.
I always say, you see, I used to be very, very, very angry about all this. I used to be extremely angry, right? And I always said it, and I used to visualize Vaughan in his old age, and if I could only meet him.
I see.
And if he was in a wheelchair, I'd wheel him straight into the river. This is what I used to imagine, and like, I'm not that kind of person, really. I'm not like that. But this is what they bring out in you. You know what I mean? They bring out the worst sides of people. They do things to people that leave them they do damage, a lot of damage, and ways that I don't fully understand, because I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. All I know is that they injure you in a place that is not very easily fixed or even band-aided, if you know what I mean.
As Christopher Hitchens once put it, it's a pity that there's not a hell for these people to go to.
Yeah. You see, I had to let them off the hook, if that's the way of describing it, for my own sake.
Yeah. I
always wanted to lash out and get revenge, right? But now these people are probably, well, I know for a fact that Vaughan is dead. I don't know about any of the rest of them. But like, I always wanted to exact revenge on them and lash out and do. But I figured out in the finish that I had to let them off the hook for my own sake. I wasn't forgiving them for their sake. I was forgiving them for my own sake.
Because hate is baggage.
Yeah, exactly. So I had to let them off the hook so I could get off the hook.
Yeah.
And that's basically what's happened. It wasn't an easy experience. And like, it's all like, retrospectively, you see, like, you learn, like anything in life, you learn as you go along. And as you get a little bit older, well, most people get wiser. Not everybody gets wiser, but most people get, and I consider that I've got a bit wiser as I've got a bit older. And I realized at a certain stage that I was going to have to let these people off the hook. as much damage as they had done to me, I had to let them off the hook so I could move on myself. And I did that. And I now have, like I say, a perspective that I can live with.
I'd love to close, because I know you've got other commitments today. I'd love to close by asking you one final question, if that's okay.
Sure.
Would you have any advice for anybody who might be listening to this, who might be suffering physical abuse or any kind of abuse, maybe at the hands of their parents or maybe at the hands of the church currently? Because we know that there are still cases of abuse that are discovered. Thankfully, it's not as common today as it was when they had the power that they had. But do you have any advice? Because you seem to have made peace, if that's the right phrase to use. You seem to have a very good psychological grasp of it all, and you know the leisure, if you would permit the use of that word, the leisure at which you talk about it, the ease at which you talk about it, seems to demonstrate a kind of a psychological accomplishment. As you said, you've had to learn to deal with it. What advice would you give to those who have suffered at the hands of the church in the past, or might be suffering today, any kind of abuse? Maybe it's a spousal abuse or whatever. Would you have any advice for people to get to the place where you're at, where you've managed to cope with it? I know that's a big question.
It is a big question, because
and I haven't prepped you with this question, but I just thought it might be interesting to ask.
Bear in mind that I have no expertise in this area. I am not a psychiatrist, psychologist. I am not a counselor of any kind, right? I've had a degree. I've met psychologists, and I've spoken to counselors at various times throughout the years when I have run into when these issues have become overbearing for me, and I have learned from that. And like, it's common parlance, talk about it. Yeah. Talk, and talk about it again and again and again and again and again. It takes the power from it. It takes that's for someone, will say, who's experienced it before and will say out of the way of it and now trying to recover from it. Talk about it, cry over it, talk about it, cry over it. That's what works. It worked for me. Apparently, it's the talk therapy is the way to deal with these issues. Bottling it all up, it all festers and just becomes worse, and it just becomes a pure poison. It poisons your whole system, and then that will manifest in all kinds of negative ways. You need to talk about it. Find someone that you can talk to and talk about it, and continuously talk about it, and it takes the power away from it. But for someone who's actually living it and actually being currently abused, there's huge changes there. There are people to go to now, and you can say, listen, this stuff is happening to me. That facility wasn't there when I was going to school. Like, I went home to my parents and told them and that I was terrified. They didn't understand. They didn't have the understanding that people have now. They said, you're going to school and that's it. Like, it was a dysfunctional environment anyway. So it was, again, in retrospect, it was, I used to blame them to a degree as well, that they had forced me to go to school when I didn't want to go. They thought I was just trying to get out of school, which would have been the case anyway. If I could have ducked school, I would, because I didn't like school because of what was going on there. Yeah, so, shockingly enough, kids don't love school when they're being beaten to within an inch of their death. Yeah, in general, I would have preferred to be out playing cowboys and Indians than going to school. But when I was telling my parents that I was terrified of these teachers, they thought it was just another ruse to get out of going to school again, you know? And like, they weren't fully cognizant of what was going on because of the lives they were living themselves, you know what I mean? They had their own issues and all that kind of stuff. So it was a dysfunctional environment. That's the best way I can describe it. And that didn't help the situation either. But what I would say to anybody who's currently suffering anything like that is to seek out, there are relevant authorities there, like the police, the social services. They are there. They will listen to you, and they will help you. You know what I mean? Yeah. Now that requires courage, of course. Yeah. It requires courage. But again, like I said, for anyone who's, we'll say, trying to get through it, talk. Yeah. Like I've spoken here today, I'm able to talk about it now without floods of tears, which is, and I'll freely say it, I've left buckets of tears over this. But all those tears were a way to recovery, if you know what I mean.
Well, Dad, I'll say in closing, here's to talking about it, and thank you very much for talking about it. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close out?
No, it's just that I'm very proud of you, and you're teaching over in England, and you don't do any of this shit that those people done, and you're a good, honest, stand-up guy who looks after kids in his class and cares for them, and that's what teaching should really be about. And good for you.
Well, that means a lot. That means a lot, Dad. Thanks very much. And I'm sure my viewers and listeners will join me in thanking you for joining us here today, despite how accomplished you are in terms of speaking about it and, the grasp you have over it all. It still can't be the easiest thing in the world to put your entire, psychology out on the line like this. And I sincerely appreciate you doing it. It means a lot.
I only hope that it may help somebody else. That's all.
Me too. Okay. And I can't think of a more positive note to finish on. Thanks for joining me here today, Dad. It means a lot.
Okay, Dara.
Appreciate it.
Talk again soon. Take care.
Lovely. All the best, Dad. Thanks.
Bye-bye.